So there's a number of different component parts really that make up the security target operating model. The first thing is to identify what the drivers and influences are for your strategy going forward. So it might be that you need to examine the cyber threat landscape that you exist in. You might need to look at the key risks and some of the incidents perhaps that you've experienced over a period of time, but it's starting to get an understanding of what is it that's driving you and pushing you to put in place your strategy and to pursue a program of change. So the second part of the security target operating model looks at the framework, the storyboard essentially, that represents what it is the security team does to support the enterprise. So it could be looking at the different functions and what roles they play and the dependencies between the various parties. It could be looking at GRC, the governance, risk and compliance component of the security team, and how that relates to setting of policy and the governance activities, training and awareness, and how that then relates to the security architecture function. So they would respond essentially to the things, the risks that have been identified, the policies and standards that have been set from a GRC perspective. Then that would convert into a package of work from security architecture that's defined in a blueprint or a design into the delivery function. They would deliver on the obligations and on the objectives that have been set out within the designs that traces back to the policies and the standards. That would then go into the operational world where the various controls would persist in terms of the operational life cycle of that particular service or product, whatever it might be. They would do all the heavy lifting essentially in terms of logging and monitoring and any other additional controls that have been defined. And then finally looking at things like testing and validation. So how independently aware are we as to the effectiveness of the controls that are put in place? So it could be a penetration test, it could be vulnerability scanning, it could be a number of different requirements validation or compliance management type activities that we would put into that area. And then obviously whenever we have gaps that emerge in terms of those activities, then they all relate back to risk. So really we're talking about a life cycle of risk and how we mitigate that throughout those various phases of the security team's activities. We also then think about the need for a service catalogue. So how do we present the capabilities that the security team offers to the enterprise? Often what we see is that that's quite isolated and very few people know about what the security team actually do. But we need to open a shop window, we need to be very service oriented in how we present the capabilities to the enterprise. And that really talks to things like service level agreements, looking at the coverage of the service itself, looking at the operational procedures and looking at the various KPIs and SLAs, etc. that fit into that. So that's a really important component also of the target operating model. We also think about the organisational design that supports the services that we're setting out and looks at the framework that we envisage for the organisation. So how does that look in terms of reporting lines and owners of the various functions and the day-to-day management really of the team? And then following on from that, you have to look at the sizing of that team. So how many people do we need to support the GRC function? What demand do we have for security architecture and the support that they do? How many licenses and how big a SIEM platform do we need or a SOC do we need to do the security operations activities? So all that thing in terms of sizing is important because it supports whether the success criteria essentially for the security team, because if they have too much demand and not enough capacity, then we're kind of doomed to failure and we're always trying to play catch up in terms of what we can cover within the organisation. And then lastly, but not least for me, in terms of the target operating model is what is the plan? How do we transition from where we are today to where we need to be in 3 to 5 years' time? What's the effort required either internally or with support external partners to actually get this thing mobilised and to make it work? So making the commitment is one thing, but actually then delivering on it is another. So for me, that transition plan is important because it essentially defines what security improvement program or what security transformation program you may wish to initiate in order to address what you've set out within the security target operating model.